When you think of a city, what comes to mind? Bright lights, traffic, big crowds? This would be a common description of what a typical city looks and feels like, right? However, not all cities in the world are the same. What happens when you remove all the things that make a city, including its residents? Such a scenario might sound like something straight out of a movie, but the truth is, abandoned cities are more common than you may think, and the stories behind them are all the more fascinating. Varosha Cyprus is one of the world's largest abandoned cities that, for the most part, is totally unknown to the world. This eerily empty city holds secrets larger than you may imagine possible. In fact, until very recently, entry into Varosha was actually forbidden by law. So what is the story behind the abandonment of Varosha? Prior to 1974, this city was a successful tourist spot, adorned with numerous hotels, shopping centers, and of course, beautiful beaches. Varosha was also a hub for art and creativity. This leaves you wondering, how did something so fruitful and expansive fall to pieces? In 1974, Turkey invaded Cyprus. Backed by the Greek government, the Turkish forces quickly gained control over more than half of Cyprus. This takeover included the entirety of Varosha. During this time, tens of thousands out of the city's 39,000 residents left their homes in hopes of escaping with their families from a threat of violence. The fleeing residents of Varosha left most of their belongings during the Turkish invasion and assumed that they would eventually be able to return once the situation had settled. Unfortunately, the Turkish forces soon declared the area a military zone that no one was allowed to enter. This turned Varosha into a ghost town, with houses that still held the memories of the families that once lived there. Today, the local shops are still open, with clothes hanging on racks, and restaurants with food that had been decaying in the kitchens. For all these years, the town has been stuck in time, waiting patiently as buildings slowly collapsed and cars began to rust. However, in 2021, the main beach area in Varosha was reopened for tourists, with all the abandoned buildings in the background. Not exactly an ideal backdrop for a scenic vacation. Turkish President Erdogan has mentioned hopes to reopen the resort town to let people live there. But the move has received backlash from Greek Cypriots who believe that the city belongs to them. Ordos, China was once called the City of the Future. How could a city dubbed with such a name become a ghost town? In the early 2000s, China experienced an economic boom thanks to the efforts of coal mining. Once these efforts began to take off, the government decided to invest heavily into urban development. Ordos was a massive urban architecture project that was planned to hold over 1 million people. The city was built with huge residential towers, state-of-the-art sports facilities, and office blocks, among other things. The plan was for the best schools, government facilities, and hospitals from the nearby district of Dongsheng to be moved to Ordos. And, of course, with a city holding such amenities, new residents would follow. However, China's economic boom suddenly saw a crash, and the original plan for Ordos had to be scaled down quite a bit. It was reduced from being a city for 1 million residents to 500,000 and then 300,000 residents. During its first 5 years of construction, Kangbashi was able to build a complete downtown area, replete with grandiose government buildings, a world-class museum, an opulent opera house, and a library designed to look like a row of books on a shelf. This also included a significant amount of commercial housing. Unfortunately, not many people made the move. The main reason being that there weren't any communal facilities for people to justify the move. In 2016, some 100,000 people lived and worked in Ordos. But high property taxes and poor construction made the city unattractive to newcomers. Slowly, people began moving out of Ordos, leaving it to be an empty shell of a futuristic-looking city. As of 2021, news articles are beginning to report that the city is finally starting to once again grow in population. At this point, we've all heard the story of Chernobyl. Whether through books, documentaries, or even movies, you would be hard-pressed to find someone who doesn't know the name of it. But if you haven't heard of this legendary city, you may be surprised at the harsh reality behind it and its nearby city of Pripyat. Known famously now as the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone, Pripyat was once a small town with a population of about 50,000 people. It housed both employees of the nearby Chernobyl nuclear power plant and the builders of the city along with their families. Pripyat had restaurants, malls, schools, and pretty much all the makings of a normal city. However, in April of 1986, the town went through a tragedy like no other. A reactor at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine exploded, releasing huge amounts of radioactive materials into the air, leading to the worst nuclear accident in history. As a result of the radiation exposure, people in Pripyat started becoming sick, reporting horrible headaches and a metallic taste in their mouth a few hours after the explosion. It wasn't until the next day when the government started evacuating people. Residents were told to grab only basic necessities and that their evacuation from the city would only last 3 days. That, of course, did not hold true. While the area's contamination levels eventually did begin to drop, the residents were wary of returning in fear of the risks associated with doing so. To this day, scientists agree that the town is still enveloped by dangerous amounts of radiation, which is why Pripyat remains a ghost town that people can only visit at their own risk. Many years ago, when individuals developed contagious illnesses, they would be sent off to far-off lands where they would stay until they recovered. In worse cases, let their illness get the best of them. North Brother Island, lying between Manhattan and the Bronx, was the quarantine location for the ill and dying. Ironically, the island wasn't really built to become a quarantine zone at its inception. Since its construction in the 1600s, the North Brother Island was used as a landfill. The first man-made structure on the island was the Riverside Hospital, established in 1885. It was a quarantine hospital dedicated to holding people with infectious diseases. Eventually, the government started using the land to build more hospitals and quarantine centers. Rumor has it, the conditions that the patients were kept in were less than ideal. In fact, many of the patients that arrived at the facilities were never heard from again. It's suspected that unhygienic medical conditions and shortages of food led to a myriad of deaths on the island, giving it a bad reputation. In the 1940s, the island's hospital was transformed into a place where war veterans and their families could live with functioning roads, schools, restaurants, and residential buildings. But most didn't remain there for long, choosing to live in the city instead due to the impracticality and expense of living on an island. In its last decade, it was used as a treatment center for heroin addicts. But after staff corruption, a lack of funds, and negative patient reviews, the island shut down for good in 1963 and has since been left alone, with humans being forbidden from entering the area because of safety concerns. Hashima Island is located about 9 miles away from Nagasaki and is one of the most historically rich locations in Japan. The island of Hashima was Japan's hub for coal mining and was majorly a coal facility from 1887 to 1974. After the once abundant coal mines in Japan started depleting, mixed with the worldwide move towards petroleum, the island slowly lost all business. In January of 1974, Mitsubishi began closing the Hashima mines. Soon enough, the mines were shut down, leaving its residents no other option than to move elsewhere. For the next 3 decades, no one really paid attention to the decaying island of Hashima that was once Japan's most profitable site. In just 3 short months, the entire island had been wiped of its population. With nobody there to tend to the location, the schools, apartments, houses, and restaurants collapsed into rubble. But that's not all. During World War II, large quantities of Korean and Chinese prisoners of war were forced to enter the island as laborers. These prisoners worked under extremely harsh conditions, which resulted in many deaths. As a result, Hashima Island was declared an unsafe zone where people were subject to malnutrition and exhaustion due to working in the mines without regulations. After being restored, the island was opened to tourists in 2009, where they could come and see this ghost town in the state that it was left in during the 1970s. The island has also appeared in films such as James Bond's Skyfall, which conveys just how deformed it truly is. Even to this day, the vast majority of the island remains off-limits to visitors, as the massive investments needed to ensure the safety of the aged buildings would ultimately lead to the island's historical state being ruined.